Welcome. The reality in Los Angeles is you can't time or plan anything, but we're very grateful that you're here. It is Palm Sunday. It was Passover. We're very, very pleased you're all here, and we're streaming live. We also want this to be a comfortable afternoon, so please feel free to get up, get coffee, get cookies, and engage in what we think is a pretty special conversation. We're calling this End of Transition, and when we decided way back when that that's what we're going to call this event, I mentioned it to my then boss, the dean of Dornsife, the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. I said, we're going to have a conference. We're calling it End of Transition. And he said, you're going to put a question mark at the end? And I said, no, we're not going to put a question mark at the end. Not because the transition is complete, but because we're not certain that it's a transition. And we don't see where the post-Soviet space is heading. We don't see where it's going to arrive, or what to call this journey. But it does seem rather clear that maybe it's not a transition anymore. And you might say, who cares? This is just academic talk. But I don't think so. I think that the people who care are the people of Armenia and the Caucasus, and really the whole post-Soviet space. They gave up stability and predictability. You might say they lost it. They didn't really voluntarily give it up. But the point is, they don't have that stability and predictability that was a mark of the Soviet Union. And they did that in exchange for what? That's what they want to know. And frankly, that's what we're going to be asking over these 2 days. We're grateful that you're here. And for those of you watching at home and around the world, we're happy that you're all here as well. Those who are here, if you want to send a message to anyone anywhere, urge them to watch armenian.usc.edu. And the recording will be up immediately when we conclude this conference, and it'll be up forever on YouTube. It's also being expertly interpreted into Armenian by Khachadur Adomyan at the CivilNet Studios in Yerevan right now, in the middle of the night, and it's being streamed in Armenian as well as in English. And of course, where would we be if we didn't have a hashtag? It's hashtag Armenia EOT. And for those of you who would like to be president one day, please tweet. Feel free to tweet, feel free to Facebook. Let me tell you how we got here. About 2 years ago, my colleagues Silva Sevlian, Susanna Bedrosian, Dr. Karina Avedisyan, and at that time Clara Gharibian, we said, what are we going to do with this 25th year of Armenia's independence coming? We really should undertake a public exploration of what these 25 years have meant. Is there indeed a shift of focus these 25 years later, after the Soviet collapse? And in order to hear the specialists talk about these topics, we decided to convene this international conference, and it's going to be held in 2 cities. Here at USC, today and tomorrow, and in Yerevan, for obvious reasons. When we issued the call for conference participation, we received 93 applications from 21 countries. We accepted 33, and you will hear half of them today and tomorrow. Still, you will see that there are lots of areas not covered, and we know that. There is definitely a clear need to offer support to scholars, senior scholars and young scholars, to really delve into the complex social, demographic, economic, and of course the political aspects of this question. So with support from some generous and thoughtful donors, we issued a call for research proposals that would receive funding from the Institute. This time we received 61 applications from 11 countries, and we were able to fund 24. And we're not talking about extravagant amounts of money. We're talking about support to make possible some travel, some archival work, a couple of months of serious research and writing. And we've barely scratched the surface, and we're eager to find new funding partners to continue to do what's essential. Support the scholars and the scholarship about the questions that matter for Armenia and the diaspora. Tomorrow, we will hear from some of the scholars who were recipients of this research support, not all of them. And those of you who will be unable to come tomorrow, I have a suggestion. Either quit your jobs or watch armenian.usc.edu. Tomorrow, for those of you who are coming, it's not in this space. It's across campus. Well, across campus. It's a beautiful small campus in the University Club. Very close, equally close to the parking structure. In addition to the scholars whom we will hear tomorrow, and you have their names in the programs, and if you don't have programs, wave, raise your hand, we'll get some to you. Silva, if we can get some, thank you. I'm very proud that today we have with us, either live or virtually, 6 prominent authorities, some academics, some practitioners, who have witnessed and analyzed the transition of this quarter century from the vantage point of the region. We're proud to be venturing into this most complex topic of global dimensions, and we're grateful to the people I'm about to introduce and those we will introduce tomorrow, many of whom are here, for sharing their knowledge. Let me tell you who they are briefly, and then we'll start. Ambassador Jack Matlock was the last U.S. envoy to the USSR, a man who was in fact there at the collapse, and who can speak about policy as it was developed, at the end of one era and the beginning of another. Ambassador Matlock is not here in person. He spoke to us by Skype. He's 87 years old, a frequent television commentator, and he will be physically present at the conference in Yerevan in May. So you may want to think about coming too. The second speaker is Amberin Zaman, who is both knowledgeable and passionate and brave and endowed with huge intellectual agility. It's a privilege to be able to work with someone like her, formerly the Turkey correspondent for The Economist, currently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a columnist for Al Monitor, the online source, and a frequent commentator on not just Turkey, but the whole region. Amberin lived in Armenia off and on for a couple years, 3 years, as her diplomat husband served at the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan. So she knows the region from the inside. And we're especially grateful that in the run-up to the Turkish referendum next week, she managed to find the time to fly out for this conference here today, albeit for just 24 hours. The third speaker was first my boss, and now a colleague and a friend. Vartan Oskanian left Los Angeles, moved to Armenia with independence, served in Armenia's foreign ministry for 17 years, 10 of those years as foreign minister, and went on to serve in Armenia's parliament as well. He remains one of the few individuals who can probe and explain Armenia's geopolitical challenges in the context of regional and global developments. We did not think we'd be able to secure his participation so soon after the recent election, but we're very pleased it worked out and grateful he's here. Daron Acemoglu is also going to speak via Skype. I spoke to him earlier this week when it became clear that he would not be here physically. But a chance, under any circumstances, to speak with this preeminent young economist, one of the 10 most cited economists in the world, about Armenia, that was a chance we weren't going to miss. His book, Why Nations Fail, has become a textbook for those engaged in development work around the world, including in the post-Soviet space. And on top of it all, he's a Bolshoi. Finally, an old friend who represents the best of the West's efforts to support the transition that is wished for in the Caucasus. Dr. Hans Gutbrod left Germany, moved to Georgia a decade and a half ago, and directed the Caucasus Research Resource Centers with offices in Yerevan and in Baku and in Tbilisi. It's a rare data collection and analysis center that is an organic part of the region. It's not an outside observer. It builds research and analysis capacity in the region. He has since founded and directs Transparify, a non-governmental organization that focuses on enhancing the financial accountability of non-governmental organizations. Hans has observed and studied social, economic, and political trends, civil society, and social movements in the Caucasus, and it's only right that we conclude today's program with his take on bottom-up processes in this quarter century of transition. We're grateful that he made the trip from Georgia. Finally, one of the best things about working on a university campus, especially this one, is that the Institute benefits from the enormous intellectual resources and human generosity around us. The Institute is fortunate and honored to be able to partner with Professor Robert English on some of our programs and to benefit from his knowledge and, as you will see, his passion. Those of you who followed Celebrity Diplomacy, Rob moderated that program as well. He will moderate today's program, as well as the first session tomorrow morning. Robert English was, until very recently, director of the USC School of International Relations. He is the author of Russia and the Idea of the West, Gorbachev, Intellectuals, and the End of the Cold War, an intellectual history of the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev and his new thinking in the USSR. Rob spent time in Armenia and Georgia in the early 90s, and he saw the process of the collapse as it happened. We're very grateful to all of you for being here, and especially grateful to our speakers. Rob, all you.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to one and all. And I want to say at the outset a couple of words of special thanks to Salpi, a couple of words about Salpi, because if I don't, it might just get lost in all the substance, all the politics, all the rest. She's so modest, but those of you who are at all affiliated with the Institute or take part in any Armenian and related South Caucasus events here at USC know that it's her energy, her inspiration, and her leadership that make all this possible. Having been at USC for years prior to her arrival, it's just impossible with that perspective to communicate how much she has enlivened, awakened, given birth to a new renaissance of Armenian studies in all its dimensions here at USC. Of course, the genocide, the diaspora, but Armenian politics today, social media, youth, economic, cultural, historical issues, all given new life and new insight thanks to her institute and thanks to her leadership. Salpi, thank you. I am Robert English, and my role here is pretty limited. Having now praised Salpi, I'll say one word of distress. She took away half my job, which was to introduce the other speakers, but she did it better than I could have. The other half of my job is, again, to moderate, stimulate discussion, and try to weave together some of the complex and seemingly separate strands of historical, political, social, and economic forces that is shaping the fates of the post-communist countries, and particularly, for our interest, those of the Trans or South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, the ones with which we are primarily concerned. So let me just say a few words at the outset to set the stage and then yield to our speakers. The title, as you see everywhere and as Salpi reminded us, is End of Transition. And with or without a question mark, there is a question. For me, there are two principally. One is, have we indeed reached an end? 25 years on, are the paths and the fates of the post-communist states now absolutely clear? Is the process of transition nearing an end? Is it at an end? Not that political, economic, or social changes will not continue, but that the destination of the various countries are now essentially known, or at least fairly clearly in sight. Is that the case? The second reason for a question mark or a question is to ask a more basic question: just what has this transition consisted of? We can't know the answer to the first question about where it's going or where it's arrived unless we know what the main dynamics of the process itself have been. What are the key elements of the transitions that we're analyzing? It's only been 25 years. And going back to the beginning, at one time, at the outset, many assumed that after decades during which the various Soviet peoples, the Soviet republics, suffered under a dictatorial, imperially directed, Communist Party managed system, that they would now naturally return to the European or Western path of free market economics and liberal politics. So the transition, as understood then, was simply a return to the natural or normal path of liberal development, which then most of us assumed would proceed fairly smoothly, as there were no more major obstacles or ideological challenges, right? We'd reached the end of history. But soon enough, it wasn't the end of history, but the return of history that preoccupied us. That would be the return of history in the form of national or ethnic conflicts that were erupting all around the post-communist world. Demands for autonomy or secession, demands for retribution, demands to redraw borders, and an explosion of national, ethnic, and religiously charged violence that clearly had its roots in the unresolved conflicts and lingering resentments of the past. In other words, the return of history. And so the study of transitology got more complicated. And yes, there was, and for some remains, such a term, as if this was a scientific enterprise, transitology, the study of transitions. But it turned then from these simple universal assumptions now to more and more appreciating local or regional particulars. Not just inherited conflicts from the past, but also the vastly differing endowments of history and geography. Some post-Soviet states were blessed with natural resources in abundance, others were not. Some were blessed with stable borders, others were contested. Some were blessed with unified and homogeneous populations, others were cursed with the opposite. And so on until a term, path dependency, seemed to replace transition or transitology. Path dependency meaning, essentially, where you finish the race depends greatly on where you began it. Not all of the competitors, if this is indeed a race, were starting from the same position. Some had these blessings endowed from history, and some had these curses. And there were many more than those few I enumerated. I might just add differing legacies from the time of Stalinism and the terror. In other words, political cultures, some that were still unified nations and peoples with a sense of purpose of returning to Europe or returning to their proper liberal path of development, and other peoples still seemingly in thrall of the post-Stalin terror, dispirited, disunited, corrupt, and in some sense doomed. So these are the different starting points of path dependency. And again, those that start well usually finish well. But now, and I'll bring this chronicle of our changing approaches to post-Soviet, post-communist politics to a close in a moment, that too seemed, path dependency, a little too deterministic, a little too limiting. Because history knows, including recent history, of too many examples of states, of nations that have made good of very little, or have made very little out of very much. Rich states endowed with natural resource blessings that have turned it into a curse, or poor impoverished states that have somehow organized and unified to leap ahead. And these differences point up the importance of good leaders and good policies. And these are idiosyncratic things. They're hard to predict just on the basis of the inheritance from the past. And also the importance of the establishment of effective institutions, effective constitutions, and political systems. The IMF and the World Bank, to take one example, sometimes applied policies supporting transition states that proved remarkably effective. In other cases, they backfired terribly. In some cases, we see the positive impact of business, of outside actors, of diaspora populations, and neighboring states in general on one or another country's transition. In other instances, we see the exact same kinds of forces exerting a negative impact. maybe the simplest illustration of what I'm describing, the continuing importance of idiosyncrasy of human leadership and of choices made in overcoming the legacies of the past or succumbing to them, is in drawing a comparison between a leader, a post-communist leader like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia and later the independent Czech Republic. Contrast what you know about him, his example, his vision, his moral leadership, with one next door in the former Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic. And for all the other differences between the inheritance, the endowments, the historical legacy of communism in Central Europe versus the Balkans, there is no doubt that the Czechs were very fortunate to have a Havel to step into leadership, and the Serbs and Yugoslavs in general were very unfortunate to have a Slobodan Milosevic. Or think of simply the difference more recently between a Boris Yeltsin and a Vladimir Putin. So, I could go on, but there are people smarter and more experienced than me who are going to take some of these broader lessons, these insights, and apply them to the specific cases at hand. Maybe in most instances they'll show how foolish I am, or they'll point to other factors that I've even ignored, but I hope at least this sets some of the stage for our approach to end of transition in Armenia and the Caucasus. It remains for me now just to say one more word about what comes next. That is Ambassador Matlock, and get off the stage. And I'd like to elaborate a bit on Salpi's introduction of Jack Matlock so that you fully understand with whom you'll be speaking in one moment. Matlock is certainly one of America's most distinguished diplomats in the tradition that stretches from Benjamin Franklin to George Kennan. He not only represented his country with extraordinary skill, but played a vital personal role in the world-changing transformation that was the Cold War's end. Matlock was Ronald Reagan's, remember President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s? He was first Ronald Reagan's National Security Council specialist on Russia and Eastern Europe, and then in 1987 was appointed American ambassador to Moscow, to Gorbachev's USSR. In both of these roles, in the White House and in the embassy, in numerous written analyses and intense personal meetings, Matlock encouraged both Reagan and Gorbachev on the path to reconciliation. Matlock's ambassadorship was unprecedented in its dynamism and outreach in the host country. And he was known for his presence not only in Russian politics, interviews, news media, cultural events, always in the thick of things, but also in supporting the rights and aspirations of the USSR's non-Russian peoples, from the Baltics to the Caucasus. In his renowned memoir, Autopsy on an Empire, which I would still highly recommend to any who have not read it, Autopsy on an Empire, Matlock analyzed the complex economic, historical, political, and social forces that caused the Soviet collapse, including the nationalist conflicts of the South Caucasus. In our recent conversation, Matlock recalls how events unfolded in the late 1980s, how things appeared in Moscow and Washington at that time, the actions taken or not taken, considered and then rejected by the various governments and leaders, and then how events have transpired since in the 2+ decades after the Soviet collapse. With that, I guess it only remains for me to thank you once again and turn the floor over, if I may refer to it that way, to our technicians who are going to bring us Jack Matlock. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Matlock. Let's get right to some of your recollections. Can you start by recalling for us the perspective from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and your reporting to Washington, D.C. on the crises in the Transcaucasus in the late 1980s? What struck you most about the situation in Georgia and about the emerging conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan at that time?
We were watching it very closely indeed, and we were aware of not only of the problems in Georgia, the pressures on Abkhazia, the attacks on Skin Valley. Then, of course, we followed the controversies between Armenia and Azerbaijan, particularly over Nagorno-Karabakh, the massacre in Stepanakert, and then later the follow-up in Baku. We followed all that very closely. I traveled several times to the area and spoke to the party secretaries. And I would say, I can't say there was a U.S. policy because basically these were things that the Soviet Union had to deal with. Our own foreign policy could only go so far. But we did try to explain to Washington what the problems were. I think most of us thought that Gamsakhurdia in Georgia was acting very irresponsibly, particularly in militarizing those things. And talking to the Armenian and Azerbaijani communist secretaries, they frankly were in despair. Both of them said, we can't solve this. There's just too much pressure at home. Moscow has to impose a solution. But aside from sending Volsky down for a while, Gorbachev was not willing to, I think, to take a more active role. It was against his principle of not, applying force to these things.
Can you say a few additional words about the Karabakh Committee and the sort of vacillation as it appeared to some of us outside of the central government in approaching the Armenian, the Armenian claims, the awakening of Armenian politics towards Karabakh?
Well, I think the people in Moscow were in a quandary because the Azeris were taking a very hard line, particularly on the sovereignty issue. And when violence started at Stepanakert, the Armenians reacted by peacefully but forcibly forcing the Azeris out of Armenia, those that had been resident there, including those in Nagorno-Karabakh. I recall the Azeri party secretary saying, we have no place for these people. We have no housing. What are we going to do? And it was precisely they that led that later pogrom in Baku. So I think we looked at it as a tragic confrontation that actually, obviously, if Moscow had been willing to use massive force, they could have done it. But I think that Gorbachev was trying not to use force to solve these problems. I recall, for example, in Armenia, talking to the first secretary, his name then was Vartan, and his own son was demonstrating sort of full-time in Yerevan on behalf of the Karabakh Committee. Yet, when I got to Baku, spoke at the university, every question I had was, why don't you respect our sovereignty? And that this is a challenge to our sovereignty. So it was such a hot emotional issue, particularly with the young people, both in Azerbaijan and Armenia, that we racked our own brains as to what could be done to cool this down. And there didn't seem to be any way that an outsider could be very relevant.
One more question about this. I wonder if, from your perspective, already at the very end of the Soviet Union, late 90 and then through 1991, were there important pressures from the diaspora on the U.S. government or from Turkish interests or oil interests? How did outside actors begin to impact or pressure, maybe not so much embassy in Moscow, but reflected back from what was occurring in Washington? Was that starting to mobilize by 1991?
Those who were working in Washington. I do know that related to this, the State Department had intended to have a fine Foreign Service officer, Edward Jaredjin, replace me as ambassador. And they were apparently asked by the Soviet government not to do so, saying that, in effect, to send an Armenian officer would exacerbate their nationality problems. I thought that was really too bad. one would have to ask those on the desk. I think that on the embassy, we were trying to follow events, and we were hoping that some way could be found to solve it, but feeling totally powerless when you witness I would say, the absolute determination on both sides to have it their way. Now, in the case of Georgia, I think that we recognize that Security, particularly in South Ossetia, was breaking all bounds of propriety. And it was actually when President Bush in Kiev on August 1st, 1991, spoke about suicidal nationalism, he had Georgia in mind, and particularly the actions in South Ossetia. Now, that recognition, I think, tended to fade on the part of Washington later.
Well, let's speak about that for a moment. If it's possible, just to summarize what changed, for better, for worse, in U.S. policy over the 90s. These are now independent states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. Is it possible to give a quick overview of your perspective on our policy towards the Trans-Caucasus in the 90s?
Now, on Armenia and Azerbaijan, I really was not following that close enough. Most of us, particularly outside, were trying to find ways to cool the situation. I made suggestions that perhaps there should be a joint effort of historians to look at the two narratives about Nagorno-Karabakh and try to get some agreement on what is actually factual and what is not. Actually, the fact was that it was probably very difficult to get together totally. But I can't speak to what our own government was doing. Of course, we had embassies in both places. And I know that subsequently, when my friend John Evans was ambassador in Armenia, when he took actions to respect of the genocide, he was actually fired from the post because of Turkish objections. So I think that was most unfortunate. When I was still ambassador, I know at least I personally, discussed this very often with the Turkish ambassador in Moscow, who was doing his best to cool things, not always with the cooperation of his government. For example, when the ecumenical patriarch died in Istanbul, he went to the funeral and so on. And he also, I think he also went to the funeral of some of the Armenian Orthodox. But he told me later that he was coming under criticism for his own government. But at that time, at least, the representatives in Moscow, including those of Turkey, were doing their best to try to cool the situation and avoid the continued violence.
Let me just say briefly, I salute the effort to bring historians into the picture and play a positive role. Rarely happens, but understanding the narratives and sorting out what happened in history more valuable often than recognized. That was the easy question. Let me bring our interview towards a close with a slightly harder one, and of course that concerns Armenia and Azerbaijan, Karabakh, relations between Yerevan and Baku. The Minsk process has dragged on for years, shows no signs of a diplomatic breakthrough. Just 1 year ago, we had open warfare break out. Tensions are high, military budgets soar. I don't know how to ask you, maybe I can approach it in this fashion. Is Russia interested in settling this conflict in some fashion? Can the European Union or the United States make a difference? What can break this dangerous trajectory that all parties are on? What can outside actors possibly do in this situation?
I'm really difficult to answer that question because basically I suspect that outside actors other than maybe Turkey, Russia, and Iran, don't really have a role. And there's not much we can do on one side or the other. Now, if they wished, one would think that Ankara could have some influence on Baku, for example, and perhaps Iran, and certainly Russia on Yerevan. But the emotions of the people seem to be such that they put the sovereignty issue first rather than protection on both sides of minorities, which I think should be the issue. And the fact is that, populations are very much mixed, and the South Caucasus and elsewhere, and to try to favor one over the other in any of these is going to bring problems, and you're going to the situation can settle it. I really think that the Armenians and the Azeris have to settle it, and both of them need to recognize that it's really in their interest to settle it. Others can interfere, and speaking of Russia, I think as long as Baku has been sort of hostile to Russia in some respects, and you have also the ethnic problems of Russians resenting Azeris in the vegetable markets and things like that, that they will tilt toward Armenia. So I think Russia is going to look at it, and if Russia feels that Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are becoming anti-Russian, then of course they will encourage them to have difficulties among themselves, probably in most cases rather subtly. And I think this goes back. I recall one lunch in 1991 that Secretary of State Baker had with prime ministers from the various republics, and he was asking them whether they were going to opt for sovereignty and perhaps independence. And the Armenian prime minister, as I recall, said that depends on Russia's attitude toward Nagorno-Karabakh and so on. If they support us, we'll stay in the Union, if the Soviet government does. If they don't, we will leave. So, with that attitude, and of course, eventually everybody left, but I think that Russia, with its historic interests there, does have a role to play, but whether either Russia or Turkey, assuming they wanted to, and I'm not sure they want to, could really settle it without the cooperation of the Azeris and the Armenians, I would have to question.
Well, let me bring this to a close by stipulating something and then asking your response. Looking internally, the domestic politics of Azerbaijan and Armenia don't give a lot of cause for optimism. In other words, the passion of the issue and the investment in a unilateral, we must win solution on both sides is as strong or stronger than ever. Armenia's constitutional changes now and what's happening, and of course Aliyev, his regime, it can even remind one of Saakashvili in Georgia, staking his reputation on solving this problem our way. Therefore, if the domestic politics of those two republics don't give grounds for a lot of optimism, do you think it's possible? And how can we help Russia and Turkey as the key regional actors change their position? Or is it simply a stalemate and a low-level conflict suits them just fine?
Well, I suspect that the current situation suits them fine if the option is a South Caucasus somehow alienated from Russia, which is not part of their security sphere. I don't think they're looking for colonies. But, actually the whole ethnic and economic association between Georgians and Armenians and Azeris with Russia has been very intimate. And there are certain niches that traditionally these nationalities have played. And I think it's just a tragedy that we're getting these very strongly emotional things, which I think that, frankly, I think any rational Russian leader would like to have close relations with all three, assuming they don't feel threatened with, say, NATO coming in and security threats. And also, we have to recognize that in Russia itself, the North Caucasus has been a main source of terrorism and, in many ways, a real threat to them. So Russia is obviously, I'm not one that is going to be defending Russian policy. On the other hand, they really face a series of very, I would say, very stark dilemmas when they confront their problems, both in the North and the South Caucasus.
Ambassador, I'm sorry we can't go on, but we're out of time. You've given us a wonderful foundation, your historical perspective and your insights into what's happened since. A wonderful foundation for this conference going forward. And we're very grateful. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you. I wish I could be more optimistic.
We need to move along quickly, so let me just reintroduce Amberin Zaman from the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. So much more in her biography, including Turkey correspondent for The Economist, to speak about Russia, Turkey, the U.S., the Caucasus, whatever else she finds important. Thank you, Amberin.
Thank you for coming here on a Sunday. It's a real honor to be here, and it feels kind of like home, being that there's so many, I think, Ottoman Armenian descendants here among us. I'm from Turkey. Salpi forgot to mention that. And I really want to thank Salpi for inviting me. She got a great introduction, of course, but I'd like to add that while I was living in Armenia with my husband, the American diplomat, who, by the way, his first ambassador was Ambassador Matlock in Moscow, so that's quite amazing to actually finally virtually meet Ambassador Matlock. Salpi was, with all due respect to Vartan Oskanian, the secret weapon of Armenian diplomacy. She was quite amazing, and she was the go-to person, certainly for everyone at the American embassy and all the European ambassadors. And sadly, from my point of view as a journalist, she was also terribly tight-lipped. She wouldn't give anything away. So maybe tonight over dinner and some guinea, you'll loosen up finally. So when I was coming here, because it's an incredibly fraught time for us as journalists covering Turkey, because as you know, there's a referendum in exactly a week that's critical for Turkey's future, and so I've been extremely focused on that. And when, amid all these emails that I've been receiving, like many more these days, I got the invitation to speak here. I mistakenly somehow thought that I was meant to talk about Turkish-Armenian relations, and that's what I'd prepared for. But apparently, I'm supposed to talk about Russia and Turkey and how that matters from Armenia's point of view. So I'll try and kind of readjust my sort of brain, reset everything, and try and say a few things about all of that and why Turkish-Russian relations matter to Armenia. And even if I had prepared for that, I guess after what happened this week with the United States attacking the Syrian regime, Bashar Assad, for the first time, everything again has changed, because as you, for those of you who follow Turkey, you probably know that for the longest time, Turkey and Russia were at the opposite ends of this conflict in Syria. Turkey has been openly backing regime change, and in some very controversial ways, might I add, by opening its borders to Syrian rebels and not really paying much attention to who they were, because Turkey was so focused on seeing Assad overthrown, and therefore also allowing the jihadists among those rebels, and I'm referring in particular to Jabhat al-Nusra, which is very powerful still in Idlib province, and over time to those who left Jabhat al-Nusra and eventually became ISIS, so very controversial. And so Turkey has been supporting regime change at odds with Russia and Iran. And of course, you all know that in November 2015, Turkey sort of carried that to a new level and shot down a Russian jet over the Syrian-Turkish border, and obviously hadn't calculated Putin's wrath, which was just ferocious. And very quickly, Erdogan understood, Turkish President Erdogan understood that it was a horrible mistake, because very swiftly Russia set about imposing economic sanctions on Turkey. Russian tourists are like the top people, sort of tourists coming to Turkey after the Germans, very important source of income. They stopped coming, the charter flights were stopped, Russia stopped importing Turkish produce, again, very important source of income, and at the same time sort of carried the battle to the diplomatic level and was threatening to expose Turkey's involvement with these jihadist groups at the United Nations. This all became way too costly for Erdogan, so he did a U-turn, and by June of 2016 he had formally apologized pretty much to Putin, and then suddenly we saw this huge courtship. And so suddenly Russia and Turkey were becoming big friends again. But then Turkey realized that for all this, new sort of these new friendly ties between the two countries, they still, some very big differences remained. And it seemed very clear that the Russians were not going to stop their support for the Kurds in Syria. Because as you know, both the United States and Russia support a Syrian Kurdish group known as the People's Protection Units, who are very closely linked to another Kurdish group known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has been fighting initially for Kurdish independence in Turkey, but then they decided they would settle for autonomy, so they've been fighting for Kurdish self-rule inside Turkey since 1984, and are very closely linked to the People's Protection Units, the YPG, because the YPG was in fact founded by Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader who's now in jail and who lived in Syria for many, many, many years. And so both Russia and the United States are allied with these Kurds, and Russia sees the Kurds as a very useful way of continuing to pressure Turkey to completely abandon its support for these jihadists inside Syria, and in particular two groups, Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham. As you know, Turkey has a very long border with Syria. It's about 800 kilometers long. And Idlib, the province where Nusra is very powerful, obviously relies on Turkey for logistic supplies. It's perfectly conceivable that even though Turkey is now officially at war with ISIS, that somehow al-Nusra does still benefit from its proximity with Turkey and Russia, especially after the St. Petersburg metro attack. Let's not forget that it was an Uzbek who carried it out, and we're hearing that a lot of Uzbeks are getting radicalized through Syria and through Jabhat al-Nusra. So it's not inconceivable that Russia would somehow not have been too unhappy about that chemical weapon attack, not foreseeing perhaps what the reaction of Donald Trump would be. And now, why does this all matter to Armenia? So let's go back to 2009 when Turkey and Armenia were on the brink of peace. It was a very hopeful moment. I was there at the time, and we all know what ensued. Turkey basically is the party that stepped back from that, and the reasons are probably well known to you, so I'm not going to rehash all of that. But at the time, we were all very hopeful. Turkey was on the path to democracy, we thought, and we also thought that Armenia was on that path too. And unfortunately, as things stand today, Turkey is traveling very rapidly in the opposite direction, and what might happen as a result of now Turkey once again talking about regime change in Syria and applauding what Donald Trump did is that it will find itself again at odds with Russia in ways that could propel Russia to perhaps convey its displeasure no longer just through the Kurds, but through Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Caucasus, and pulling Turkey in ways that could be very unpredictable and very risky. And what's more, with President Trump being the way he is, very unpredictable, we just don't know where this could all lead. What, for instance, if the United States decided it would be a good idea to sort of join forces with Turkey to pressure Russia in the Caucasus? What kind of an impact would that have? These are all questions that lie before us, and it's really, to me, very, very depressing that we are here today when we could have been somewhere quite different. Because if Turkey had made peace with Armenia, and let me say this, I think that for Turkey to be truly to be a democracy, we really need to face up to our past. We need to face up to the Armenian genocide. I think if we are where we are today, it's partly because we haven't done that. And I think that until we do that, not only can we progress as a society, become a full democracy, only then can we have healthy relations also with our neighbors, with Armenia, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Vartan, Oskanian, diplomat, longtime foreign minister of Armenia, founder of Civilitas Foundation, and so much else. Minister.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be back to Los Angeles and meet familiar faces, old friends. But first, I would like to thank the Institute for Armenian Studies for this opportunity. It's good to take stock of what has happened in the past 25 years and see if we can truly claim to have transited during this period of time to a new, more mature phase of development. I will be speaking about foreign policy mostly, but first I will refer to the current situation in the Caucasus, then go back to the early years of Armenia's independence and what followed. Then I will end with some thoughts on where to go from here. The Caucasus is among the world's most divided and incoherent regions. Its constituent republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, basically failed to learn from similarly grouped countries like the Benelux countries or the Baltic states, which, despite their historical grievances and political differences, came together and worked together to achieve their common goal of stability, prosperity, and democracy. This kind of a vision was not too far-fetched when the three republics of the Caucasus became independent. After all, when the Russian Empire collapsed during the First World War, these very three republics, albeit by default, ended up in a confederation. Didn't last long. Each of them took their own path of independence. But very shortly, during 2-year time, all three were absorbed in the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, similar ideas of confederation was thrown around, was circulated. One of them being Georgia's President Edward Shevardnadze's idea of common Caucasian home. Of course, none of those ideas ever materialized. What divides these three countries in the Caucasus is not religion, culture, history, tradition. It is the differing visions, prospects, convictions, and aspirations that each one of these countries espouse and pursue. To the extent that political and economic institutions define the nature of a region's international role, the Caucasus is more comparable to countries bordering North Africa than the Baltics or old Europe. Their political systems are unstable. Its economies are more oligarchical than liberal. Territorial disputes are resolved by force. And their foreign policy vectors point totally to different directions. Among the three, however, Georgia is the more democratic. They were able to force government change twice during their period of independence. First was through the Rose Revolution in 2003. The second one was through a ballot box. And this very fact gave the Georgian people the sense of empowerment. For their turn, Armenians, us, attempted to force a change of government several times, but none of them succeeded. To this day, there hasn't been a change of government in Armenia through a ballot box. And that's not a good thing. And the most recent attempt was the parliamentary election that we just held a week ago, in which I was a participant. While in Azerbaijan, no attempt has ever been made. The government and power has been changed dynastically from a father to son. And the moment he assumed power in 2003, Ilham Aliyev amended the constitution, not immediately, but later on, to basically enable him to be president for life. These contrasting experiences in democracy, institutions, and political processes have led to starkly different and dangerously divisive foreign policy approaches. Georgia, for example, opts for membership in NATO on security matters. Armenia is already a member of Collective Security Treaty Organization, the exact opposite organization, not similar in size and scale, but nevertheless they're on the opposite side. Azerbaijan is neither here nor there. They maintain strong security arrangements with Turkey and Israel while purchasing modern hardware from Russia. On economic matters, Georgia has recently signed the association agreement with the European Union, thus committing to serious and fundamental political and institutional changes to prepare the country to take on the body of European Union laws. Armenia, around the same time, joined Eurasian Union, a Russia-led organization, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and formed a custom union. Here again, Azerbaijan is neither here nor there. They avoided both organizations. Then there is Russia. Despite the formal relations of Russia with each of these republics, Russia casts a long shadow over the Caucasus. No matter what these countries do, they always have to be cognizant of Russia factor. Its real or perceived significance eventually and evidently will affect and affects the foreign policy decisions orientations of these three Caucasus republics. Georgia views Russia as its main adversary, despite its own contribution in creating that conflict and that mutual animosity. But the Georgian leaders, in my view, must understand that even a complete integration in European institutions does not compensate for the lack of total absence of relations between Georgia and Russia. If Georgia will have a sustainable development, long term, they must develop a level of relationship with Russia. For Armenia, Russia is a strategic partner, both by default and choice. But at the same time, Georgia is a geopolitical partner by nature. Russia is an extremely important country for Armenia, but Georgia is not any less. If the land link, the large passage between Georgia and Russia, which is also Armenia's land link to Russia, closes down, and it does regularly, especially during wintertime, Armenia's economy suffers. But when the Armenian-Georgia border closes down, and it happened once in 2008 during Georgia-Russia war, Armenia simply suffocates. And for this very reason, Armenia's main geopolitical challenge is not as much to develop normal relations with all its neighbors, but to try to prevent that its neighbors gang up against Armenia. And here it's extremely critical that Georgia rejects the very lucrative incentives, oil, gas, monetary, economic, that Azerbaijan and Turkey offer to Georgia to join them in isolating Armenia. Azerbaijan views Russia as a partner with whom it can trade and bargain, particularly on the issues of energy between Russia and Europe. But the moment Azerbaijan has signed on certain gas and oil projects with Europe, they lost their margin of maneuverability and their bargaining chip. Here, Aliyev must understand that for Azerbaijan to have a long-term sustainable development, it must not only exclusively rely on their oil, but also play a positive role, a constructive role in bringing an end to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Look, in the Caucasus, the nostalgia for security, predictability, and economic benefits of the Cold War cannot be a guide for a wise policy. But at the same time, a blind belief in Western alternatives, which sometimes is viewed as panacea for the region's political, economic, and security problems, does not offer solution either. If the three Caucasus republics considered seriously as what can be done under the current circumstances, they would come to the conclusion that it's the cooperative efforts that will be beneficial to everyone. But before I continue on this topic of future, let me just flash back to the early days of Armenia's independence. Then, three topics dominated the political and intellectual discourse in Armenia. One was the self-determination of Nagorno-Karabakh. The second one was Armenia's political and economic viability. as an existential issue. The third one was Armenia's geopolitical orientation as an issue of belonging. These three topics, of course, are interconnected or intertwined. But among them, the first issue was quickly decided, and there was a broad consensus that the Armenian people in Armenia, in Karabakh, and in diaspora must bear the burden collectively to provide and achieve full self-determination for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. The second topic, Armenia's political and economic viability, was more complex and controversial. Look, there's this sense of vulnerability and insecurity among the Armenian populace because of Armenia's permanent geopolitical predicament and its uneasy and every now and then tragic relations with its neighbors. This has led to the belief that for Armenians to be able to cope with such a dangerous and hostile environment, they must rely on a third force or power as a protector. During early days of independence, the leaders of national movement challenged, questioned the viability, the convenience of this thinking. And they argued if Armenia would establish normal ties with all its neighbors, it will minimize or altogether diminish the danger and the threat to its existence. This dichotomy later on was mutated to the notion that Armenians will never have a peaceful and prosperous life until there is some sort of a conclusion and resolution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that will also satisfy the needs of Azerbaijan and Turkey. The third topic was Armenia's geopolitical orientation. Look, Armenia's geographic position at the crossroads of three distinct geographic regions, Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and also its long historical influences of different layers, and also sudden removal, the moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the frontiers that defined the Cold War borders, blurred the sense of belonging of the Armenian people. But what introduced clarity then was Armenians' sense of assessment of the emerging political and economic undercurrents and realities. But more importantly, its self-perception, its vision of a future endowed with such principles and values that would be conducive to Armenia's evolution to a modern and viable country. These three topics at that time were extremely timely, important, critical, and Armenian people debated these and took a stand on these issues. In my view, these three topics also pretty much provided a blueprint for Armenia's development in the next 2 decades, and also provided a path for our transition. Now we can look on each of these paths where we are, and depending on your own understanding and assessment, you may make your own judgment as whether we've transited to a new phase, or we're halfway on that path, or whether we're happy with the position that we are in. But I don't think this matters much, as Salpi said. It's semantics. The fact is that on Karabakh issue, we are at a position where Nagorno-Karabakh's right for self-determination has been clearly defined and accepted by the international community. Our challenge today is to take that a step further, from rights recognition to move to a recognition of the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh has been self-determined already for the past 25 years. On the second topic, Armenia's political economic viability, which I call our butter and guns debate, one should not expect a conclusion. This is a difficult topic. Given Armenia's difficult economic situation today, high levels of poverty, and the threat of war hanging over our heads, this very topic was again thrust back into the forefront of our debate during this parliamentary election. But again, one should not expect a conclusion. But there's one element that needs to be introduced into this formulation. And that is the topic that Acemoglu, whom you will hear a little later, has been advocating in his book and in his speeches. And the question is following. During this period of time, has Armenia was able and willing to create the inclusive political and economic institutions to enable it to put the country on the path of development? Was that the fact, their absence, that caused the situation that we are in? Is it the external threats or the domestic deficiencies that cause or hamper Armenia's development? These are questions that after 25 years, we need to provide honest answer. Look, 25 years is a blip on history's radar, but it's enough time to make us learn from our mistakes and gives us time, gives us sense of direction. And I believe now Armenia is a grown-up, and it is time that we collectively, the government of Armenia, the people in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and the diaspora, that we match that 25-year age with a commensurate wisdom and maturity so that we can collectively take our country to a level that we like and deserve. Thank you.
Moving quickly along, another video connection to Professor Daron Acemoglu at MIT, the author of Why Some Nations Fail and world-leading development economist.
Armenia was much more outward-looking and had the support of the diaspora as a bridge to the Western world, as a conduit of ideas and practices of democracy and the market economy, and connections to the export markets and technologies of the West. But it didn't work. What has gone wrong is not a simple thing that we can summarize in a single sentence. I think there were many turns and twists, and some of it did not work out, and some of it, I think, worked out badly for Armenia. But at a very high level, I think the biggest issue is that in the transition economies where the former communist elites were totally cast aside, the transition worked much better. And in places like Russia, Uzbekistan, or Kazakhstan, where the communist elites control the process, things work really badly. And in Armenia, unfortunately, I think we are much closer to the second type of transition. And we have paid the price. So I think what could have been is that Armenia could have looked much more like the Czech Republic or Estonia, and what we got instead is a country that looks much more like Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan, which is a real shame. And what makes it even more depressing is that, in some sense, even in some of the worst transitions, like Kazakhstan, things have been getting better. Today, Kazakhstan is very far from being a democratic country, but there are at least some movements towards strengthening institutions. Whereas in Armenia, I think the beginning was stronger, and it's been getting worse and worse. And I have really come very close to losing all hope for Armenia in the last few years, because the degree of corruption, the degree of political control of politicians that are really set on sort of closing the system rather than the opening the system has been quite systematic. And civil society organizations, which were very active early on and in the middle, have, I think, become tired because the opposition against them from the state has been so strong. So I think it could have been great, and I'm still hoping that it's not too late, but many hopes have been dashed.
What would have had to be different other than casting aside those old elites? What could have been different that was within the scope and ability, capacity, resources of the powers that run Armenia?
I think there was a journalist in the in the first half of the 20th century in the United States who wrote a lot about corruption in the U.S. cities by the name of Lincoln Steffens, and his sort of motto was "Get the rascals out." So his view was that, you know, if you want to clean up the cities, voters have to systematically vote out incumbents when the incumbents are corrupt, when the incumbents are not responsive, when the incumbents are doing things that are not in their interests. And I think that's what's happened in Armenia that has not gone Steffens's way, that, you know, there have been many unsuccessful governments, but essentially for a variety of reasons, partly patronage, partly not enough civil society opposition to it, those governance haven't been systematically voted out. And I think the future can only be brighter in Armenia if, you know, the democratic process works better.
What makes democratic processes work?
Well, I don't think there is anything in the Armenian culture that I see as, you know, opposed or incompatible with democracy. So I don't think that it's culture. You know, and I know that Armenia is in a very difficult geographic place. You know, as neighbors we have, you know, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, and, you know, none of it is particularly conducive to a country that's going to sort of generate the sort of economic and the political leap forward that we would like. But I think at the end of the day, geography is not destiny in any shape. Certainly, the fact that Armenia has a difficult geography, mountainous, access to transport networks and sea is difficult. I think those are disadvantages, but they're not insurmountable. You know, we have Switzerland, which is, you know, the European version of Armenia, and it's done very well. We have Israel, which is surrounded by, you know, a series of hostile nations, you know, intent on destroying Israel. And, you know, Israel is not perfect. It has many problematic features in its institutions, but, you know, there's also no debating that it's the most successful democracy in the entire Middle East. And it's very, very advanced technologically and economically. So I think geographic factors are complicating factors for Armenia, but they're certainly not the main culprits of where we should look for the problems. I think the problems are inside Armenia's own political system. And there, I definitely disagree with the culture sort of explanations, but it is true that practices persist. And I think the way that the Czech Republic or Poland was able to break away from the communist era was by strengthening the civil society movements, trade union movements, and protest movements that existed under the Soviet times, under the communist times, and build on them. Armenia did not have the same degree of civil society organization, which is of course harder when you're part of the Soviet Union, but they developed shortly after transition, but they weren't built upon. And of course Armenia did not have the Armenia did not have the European Union to act as an anchor, to act as a model. It was supposed to have the diaspora, but I think the effect of diaspora has been mixed, in that, first of all, diaspora has been a source of easy money for Armenia, and easy money is really what breeds the worst kind of corruption in a weak institutional environment as Armenia's. And I think, the war with Azerbaijan and sort of the increasing tensions with Azerbaijan coming and going all the time haven't helped the political process also. But there are no two ways about it. I think we have to build on the same strengths that are crucial for the emergence of democracy everywhere: civil society, freedom of press, organizations ranging from student organizations to trade unions to professional business organizations, and political parties that are, free and are not just conceived as patronage machines. I think those need to sort of develop, and the only way for them to develop is by political leadership and push from the bottom.
The examples you gave, Czech Republic, Israel, both of them benefited from hundreds of years of the Eastern European Enlightenment, liberalization traditions. Where do we find that in Armenia?
Well, I think Armenia has over, almost 2,000 years of culture that's also has the very enlightened aspects. Of course, then you look back to Jewish culture. It has very enlightened parts, and it has very non-enlightened parts. It's the same with Armenia. I think it's a question of which ones you pick and choose. Same thing, Hungary. Hungary was the most feudal part of the Austrian Empire, and it was very repressive. It had all the wrong sorts of things. But if you're a Hungarian intellectual, you can appeal to the better parts of the Austro-Hungarian heritage. So I think that is the sort of part that's crucial. And again, the environment is not to be dismissed. When you are locked into an existential struggle against Azerbaijan, it's much easier for politicians and perhaps parts of the public to bring out the more nationalistic, the more hostile elements of the traditions and the past, rather than the ones that are more about openness and forward-looking aspects of the country and its thought and its heritage. And I think we have to keep on doing that. We have seen throughout the Middle East and throughout Central Asia how destructive, how dangerous the nationalist, war-based, aggressive rhetoric can be, and I think there's no reason for Armenia to succumb to that.
You have said that bad institutions are self-perpetuating.
They are.
And you have also said, and you said it earlier today, that at the end of the day, it's civil society and bottom up. Except that in Armenia, it can also be said that those civil society institutions themselves are either weak or, well, let's just call them weak.
I think we've used in some of our work captured civil society. I think it's easy to see how a weak civil society can be hostage to some political agendas. Especially nationalism plays that role of sort of taking the good out of the civil society and leaving the more aggressive elements on it, and then it feeds on itself. So yes, I think those are real issues. That's why I have become less optimistic about not just Armenia, but many places in the world, but Armenia in particular. So it's not an easy struggle. But on the other hand, I meet many youth from Armenia, including some that are active in politics, and their outlook is always positive, at least the ones who come to the United States, who study at Harvard or MIT, and they want to do something in Armenia. And at least when they are sitting in Cambridge or Boston, they are strongly opposed to corruption, to all the patrimonial and patronage-based practices. Now, what happens to them when they actually go in politics in Armenia, I haven't followed, but I think the values, the energy, the human capital are there. And one advantage that Armenia still has, which was a great advantage at the beginning of the transition that has been squandered, is that it is pretty high in human capital, compared to Uzbekistan, compared to Tajikistan. It has better human capital, and access to the diaspora is one aspect of that human capital. But again, that's not what the relations with diaspora have sort of been used for so far.
You're an economist, and yet we've spent all this time talking about political systems. Is it possible to talk about Armenia's economic development over these 25 years in isolation? Can we, in fact, spend a few minutes now and talk about its economic transition?
Yes, and I think the economy and the political systems are separate, and they have their own differences. But a lot of my work has emphasized that we cannot separate them. The real potential of the economy can only be realized when the political relations in which it is situated permit it to go in the more inclusive direction. Now, there are aspects of the Armenian economy, and again, they are related to some of the links with the diaspora, that are still sort of able to stand up despite all of the political problems, because they are integrated into a different ecosystem, an ecosystem that's outside Armenia. So you can be a good software developer in Armenia and work for some diaspora-related activity in Toronto or in Los Angeles, but that's not enough for lifting, the broad population of the country above essentially poverty, which is where we are. And so there are some hopeful aspects of the economy, and this is the sort of the better side of the relations with the diaspora. It's the better side of the human capital that Armenia is able to generate itself, and the human capital that it has somehow inherited from the Soviet university system, which wasn't perfect, but it had some technical strengths. But to be able to build on them, we just need more than sort of a small sort of protected area which sort of connects to the outside world but is out of Armenia's core economy. So for that, the political aspect is crucial, and that's why we've been focusing on it, I think.
Finally, again, within the economic sphere, is it fair to say that the areas that do excel are those that are post-Soviet sectors? Whether it's tech, whether it's medical tourism, banking, the financial sector generally?
Absolutely. And there's a good reason for that. Again, two reasons really. One is the diaspora. I think those are the areas where the diaspora made more natural investments. But the second is, I think, broader than that, and it's also related to the fact that, leaving tourism aside, those are also the sectors that have done better in the post-Soviet Russia. And the reason for that is that the Soviet state, the Russian state, has left it alone. If you're in the oil business, if you're in the construction business, those are the cash cows for the Russian state and the Russian oligarchs and the Russian security services. The same thing is true in Armenia, whereas the tech sector essentially developed outside of the purview of the state, and that's why it has that dynamic. So if we improve the state, if we weaken the corruption incentives of the state, I think other sectors can go the same way.
If you have any concluding remarks, we'd be happy to hear them.
I think we are in the middle of a very, very difficult transition process. At some level, the first half has been a success, has been a failure, but I think there's no necessity, cultural, geographic, or historical, that the second half should not be a success. But the fact that the first half has been so difficult and not so successful means that the handicap is even greater.
But possible.
Good luck, but possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank
We're halfway there, so Salpi and staff, don't throw that banner away. Just put another, make it 50 years on, and we'll revisit this. Our final esteemed guest, expert speaker, is Hans Gutbrod, the currently director of Transparify, a policy research and advocacy organization based in Tbilisi, Georgia, where he's resident. Previously a founder of the Caucasus Research Resource Network, holds a doctorate from the London School of Economics. I learned with a dissertation on tragedy in national and international politics, and so much more. Our final speaker, Dr. Gutbrod, thank you.
So my topic is the transition of everything, and what I really want to talk about is the transition away from a transition paradigm, and what that means for activism, what that means for people that want to change things, and how in a context when many people see a gathering clouds, making change is still possible. The way I thought of this and of addressing this is that it's for, in a way, a couple of different groups of listeners, what I'm trying to say. It's on the one hand, of course, for people who study this, who are interested in those categories. But I also thought I would try and make it, at least from my point of view, practical in the sense for people that want to contribute to change, that want to address some of the issues that we looked at or some of the problems that are highlighted as activists, as people that may be contributing to some causes, maybe also specifically to young people who can contribute, and to their parents who are thinking, what kind of change can I contribute to in a context like Armenia, but also outside Armenia, in this time when we're worried about reversals. Where I'm coming from, and this is kind of threefold, and I think it's important to say that in order to provide a bit of context to what I'll be talking about. On the one hand, as John English mentioned, I actually didn't found it, but I ran the Caucasus Research Resource Centers, and so had a great position maybe to observe really three very different developments, a kind of successful change in Georgia that I'll get back to in the end after the Rose Revolution, a period of stagnation in Armenia where from my first visit in 2000, you would have thought that Armenia was best placed of the three countries with the diaspora, with the talent, was best placed in many ways to move and to develop further, but still overall a period of kind of not moving so much forward. And then in many ways, in spite of the riches, a period of decline and terrible reversals in Azerbaijan. So that's one angle. The second angle is really activism myself, working with think tanks, working also on a local level. And the third angle that I want to bring to this is that I'm currently doing a study for a conglomerate of big donors that are worried about this broader rollback against civil society, against NGOs, against an open society, this context of kind of closing that is happening in many countries, at this particular point, following maybe a Russian playbook of sidelining the opposition and closing down civil space. Now let me briefly talk a couple of words about, in this broader context, about the transition paradigm. And I think many of those relevant points have been made very well by the previous speaker, also previous speakers, also by John English. What is the idea there of a transition paradigm? Well, one of the key ideas within that is that we're moving somewhere better, and we're moving there together. And if you will, one of the key parts of that idea was transferring an archetype, moving from the grumpy socialist state employee towards the content kind of middle-class citizen. That was broadly the idea of what was meant to happen there, with a process of redistribution of means of production that were in state hands, broadly to be distributed within the society with at least a relatively reasonable degree of participation. And within that, a role of NGOs, non-governmental association organizations or associations, in the same way that they provide a web of that underlies democracies, Western democracies, in often not directly visible ways unless you're practically active in them, medical associations, legal associations, but also other advocacy organizations that make a change and that were part of this idea of where one wants to move, where citizens aggregate in order to make things possible. And that transition, I think it's important to emphasize in this kind of period of gloom, that transition, at least in parts, was very successful. If you compare what people predicted and what they were worried about 25 years ago, one of the maybe exact illustrations of that is Angela Merkel, who actually comes from that Eastern environment and a country that people were worried about, actually providing a sense of stability today. It was successful in the Baltics. Arguably, it was successful even to some extent in Ukraine, where Maidan represented a kind of European or pro-European revolution, outcome uncertain, but where people stood up for certain of these values. But at the same time, we're seeing now, and there's the second part of that, I think a broader context of reversal, stagnation, and rollback. Some of that related to Armenia as well. Georgi Derlugyan, the scholar, has pointed out that there's the risk of looking at the Soviet Union as just a kind of single flat experience, but that really when you look at the Soviet Union from the point of view of many citizens, it is a history of repeated disappointments, of great promises of economic transformation that are followed with brutal reversals internally as well. Promises of liberalization after Stalin, then promises of further reform, and each time the citizens lose out and they don't actually get anything. And arguably, transition for a lot of people proved to be the same. Within that, we've also lost this kind of certainty that there is one direction and one final destination. There are various aspects to that. Loss of moral authority of the West. The West isn't seen as being able to sort out the Middle East and actually has destabilized it. At least that's the widespread view. The West isn't able to sort out itself, as we have seen in issues like Brexit and others. And these things, of course, ripple out and are visible. I've recently looked at focus group research in Moldova as well, which kind of just resonated exactly these kind of questions in addition to what we've seen in many other contexts. And within that, there's a sidelining of oppositions, and there's also extensive distrust of NGOs. And if you take the Armenian figures, 2013 figures, 3% of Armenians say they fully trust NGOs, 14% say they somewhat trust NGOs. So less than a fifth of the population fully or somewhat trusts organizations that are actually supposed to represent their interests, that are meant to aggregate the things that they care about and transmit them outwards. So one thing that's key in many Western societies for aggregating, and democratic societies for aggregating people's desires, doesn't seem to be working. And when you then look at this idea of the kind of content middle class citizen, the extent to which that works in Armenia, that's also not a success. Repeatedly, our surveys have shown that when you ask any citizen upward from age 18 whether they would want to leave their country and never come back, the figure typically is between 28 and 30%. If you just look at those under 44, under the kind of working age, you have almost 50%, certainly among the males. So rather than having a content middle class citizen, we have people that dream of going abroad and that are apathetic about the extent to which they can change. And all of this, at this particular point, risks getting worse in a context when the space for civil society organizations across the world is closing, and the playbook for that is established for how you actually close that space, for how the elites that manage to make the redistribution work in their own interest, how they can cement their interest, even in semi-democratic elections. So what are some of those aspects of that change? And that change against democracy, that kind of closing of that space, and how can we potentially react to that? In a context in particular also when in Armenia the figure is also in belief in democracy. When you ask people about do they think that Armenia is a democracy right now, 2%, this is kind of like a rounding error, say that they think it's a democracy. 11 say it's a democracy with minor problems. There's a bit more than a rounding error, but those are often people, well, at least in some cases, may also be people that are worried a little bit about what exactly they're going to be saying, but 70% say that they don't think it's a democracy at all. So what can you actually do? And if you care about change as an activist, as a young person, as a person that kind of is patriotic, what are the opportunities in this kind of in this context of change, in this post-transition paradigm? I think the very first thing that we need to be clear about is that it is a post-transition paradigm. It is no longer, we can no longer assume that things are going to be okay and that things slowly and slowly will improve. That's just not the realistic assumption. That may be possible, but that's not what the forecast is. So I think getting prepared for those changes is important because we're seeing those changes everywhere. We've seen the closing down of civic space in Russia. We've seen a kind of people copying that argument most recently in Hungary with attempts to close down, so even in an EU country, attempts to close down the Central European University, a university that gave many opportunities to many Armenians who didn't have their own funding to actually go study abroad or another scholarship. But we've also seen similar approaches in contexts that we considered settled democracies, relatively settled democracies like Israel, introduction of NGO laws. And the prongs of those attacks have become pretty settled, it's become clear where they come from. They typically revolve around kind of 5 axes. It's about the idea of foreign agents, that foreigners are coming and kind of subverting our own internal discourse, and we need to kind of stop it, and we need to stop funding for it, because those are not our own interests. This is what often gets mobilized. It's funding in general that, of course, is made more difficult. It's often kind of making it more difficult for these organizations to operate by additional reporting requirements. And then there's also a targeting of the leaderships of those organizations. This just happened 2 weeks ago in Ukraine when a law was introduced that forced the leaders of pro-democracy or pro-accountability NGOs to fully declare their entire income and fully declare their entire assets. Which in a way doesn't sound so bad, but the problem is that many of those mechanisms have enforcement tools attached to them so that actually you can target any activists who's out there and find something, and maybe find something that they haven't done right, and then start harassing them and make it much, much more difficult for them to go out and to continue their work. So this, I think, is just a reality, and one needs to be prepared for that and needs to respond. And how can one respond? Well, I think one aspect is that we need to shift the support, and we need to shift the activity, and we need to shift the focus on localization. So from the numbers that I told you, 80% don't feel necessarily that they trust NGOs. How can that be changed? How can one actually fund, how can one activate a level of engagement that makes citizens feel that those organizations work for them? That's a challenge, I think, both for the activists that go out there, maybe the people that go out to those countries right after university study or in the context of an internship or in the context of kind of an extended stay. It's a challenge for people that study the area, and it's a challenge also in particular for funders that need to think about how one moves beyond easy money into the kind of investing, one's tempted to say, a very fashionable term, investing that really makes a difference on the ground and allows people to make that kind of difference. So localization as a key aspect. And I think being very careful in this context not to fall for the outrage trap that doesn't actually serve the interests that one wants to pursue. What do I mean with this? I think a mechanism that we've seen a lot over the last year in Western democracies as well, that is the deliberate targeting of particular groups or individuals meant to provoke outrage. And the outrage then actually serves to further bolster the base and to demonstrate that one's willing to attack elites, established elites, and that therefore mobilizing international outrage on behalf of local causes often backfires in a kind of de Gaulle effect. That specifically what you're trying to achieve is the validation, because you're kind of attacked from outsiders, from a kind of cosmopolitan international elite. The implication is you're actually serving the interests of your real constituencies, the real patriots. And I think this is incredibly important to understand, because otherwise one unwittingly furthers the cause of the kind of often short-sighted nationalist intervention, the kind of cheap anti-globalism that's being undertaken, and the kind of successful localization is one of the key tasks within that context. Another thing is that studies that colleagues of mine have done show that citizens in Armenia and in Georgia are incredibly perceptive about about false promises. If you show them implausible promises, the average citizen that's often seen as not being very good at voting behavior actually gets it, that you can't promise it all. And so offering people a real option matters, offering them precise ideas about how things change matter in order to move people beyond apathy. And I'll say a little more about that in a moment. Within that, I think the idea of activism always having to have bricks and mortar, always having to have an NGO or an institution, yes, those are important, but I think having more hybrid ideas of how change can come about is realistic. And where this matters as well is that I think the funding mechanisms, including those by external funders or universities that make it possible for people to undertake these kinds of careers, that it's sensible to adapt that so that people can engage in this kind of activity on the ground and have some kind of prospect within that. And with that taken together, I think the prospects are actually not so bad. And let me end here on something that I think that kind of change, the kind of rollback that we see is in some ways a useful clarification that the old transition paradigm doesn't actually serve us, or no longer is going to take us forward, and that one does need to rethink a little bit how one goes about these kinds of things. And let me end here with really two small points in that context. I was in Georgia an election observer in the run-up to the Rose Revolution. And one of the stories that people never entirely realized when they write that history is that actually it looked like a lost cause a relatively short time before it happened. And relatively famous, not widely covered, but two of the three leading figures of the Rose Revolution, the morning of the Rose Revolution, had already given up and thought it was a bad idea. And I remember a few days before it, when most people had thought this doesn't make any sense anymore, and in the observation mission, we were redoing the lyrics of Frank Sinatra's My Way, and it was meant to be the story of Shevardnadze stealing the election again and saying, I did it again my way. We were doing this because it seemed over. Somebody in the group said, ultimately it doesn't matter whether it's going to happen in 5 days or in 5 months or in 5 years. This will happen because the level of corruption that we have here is not sustainable. This just cannot work. It cannot continue to work. People are a little doubtful, but ultimately it seemed like a convincing argument. And the reason why I think it's important to bear that in mind is that if we look at the last 15 years or the last 25 years, yes, we've had these reversals, but what we've had is we've had lots of openings that weren't used, that actually led to, that were missed opportunities, where people had 6 months or 9 months to make a change. We had that in Ukraine in 2004. We had it in Kyrgyzstan. We had it in kind of North Africa. And one of the key unifying theme is that when the opportunity came, the people that could have made the change weren't ready for it. And in that way, even if you take the darkest possible interpretation of what the future brings, even if your argument is that today we're looking at something like a situation similar to 1938, it can only get worse. Still, there's going to be, after that, there's going to be a time when the answers are needed and when there will be a window. And when that window opens, brief as that may be, the right answers are necessary. And preparing for that, even when right now the prospect seems to get darker, I think is as important as it's ever been. Thank you.
So we are going to have a moment of transition in our transition studies here. These two capable men know exactly what they're doing, so there's no doubt about the successful outcome here. And I think we're getting Hans mic'd up right now. And as soon as we clear the stage, the speakers will come up and join me, and we'll continue with follow-up questions and delve even more deeply into some of these important observations. Let me just make this a formal invitation then. Vartan, Amberin. I don't think it matters what order I was told I should be on the, it does? I'm on the far left here to the audience. And then Amberin, Minister, yeah, you're here.
Good day. Okay.
So, how are we doing so far? Interesting, right? We've got some great people. Great, thanks. And Dr. Gutbrod, thank you. Let me start this next phase just by thanking all of you for really insightful, stimulating, wonderful comments to get us going today. And I guess that includes Dr. Acemoglu and Ambassador Matlock, long distance as well. I hope they're looking or will look at this at some point. I'm going to sit down now. There's no reason I should be standing. And try to kick things off, but take it where you like. But I'll use the advantage of the chair, if I can call it that, to ask the first question, and to nobody in particular, except a common, refrain or concern throughout. We've heard, I won't say everything's static, certainly not Dr. Gutbrod's comments, but nonetheless, a lot of resistance, a lot that bodes for continued stagnation or even sharpening problems. So much of the diagnosis could give one, reason for this severe pessimism. And then, however, these examples of a possible people's revolution, some economic change that could spark something, or in the case of Amberin's comments, a realignment or major change abroad. So I guess the question is, try to be optimistic. Where do you see something shaking this loose in the South Caucasus, in Armenia, and taking things in a new and maybe unexpectedly positive direction?
Here's what really matters, is that Armenia exists. Let's not forget what happened in 1915. Let's not forget that, as far as I know, and I'm willing to be corrected, obviously, that around 60% of the population of Armenia are the descendants of the people who fled the genocide. You have a country. The Kurds, they don't have a country. So that's already, I think, a huge thing. And I think Armenians have a lot to be proud of, in fact. And as His Excellency was mentioning, okay, it's not perfect, but at least you're still trying, you're still striving. It's a very, very tough neighborhood, I think. And, given what we have at hand, Armenia is very much under the influence of Russia. Its economy is dominated by Russia. It depends on its security for Russia. But look at where Turkey's headed. It's traveling in that direction too. It's becoming less and less democratic, beginning to look more and more like an Uzbekistan, a Turkmenistan. So, let's not be too hard on ourselves. That's my sort of optimistic take. I have infinite faith in the resourcefulness of the Armenian people and their ability to survive. And I think the word survival actually matters a lot these days. Look at what's happening in Syria. It does matter. Survival matters. Armenia may not be a full-blooded Western-style democracy, but hey, it exists.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Minister Oskanian, Dr. Gutbrod, the things that you described, the health of civil society and its dynamism or lack thereof, the rationality and progressiveness of policymaking in diplomacy, but also in the economy. Again, what could bring a significant shift of direction? Are we talking about a passage of a new generation and waiting another decade for sort of bottom-up forces? Are we instead speaking about already with constitutional changes and the new generation arising and mobilization on, what we spoke about at the last conference, right? The justice for Armenia, something happening much sooner? Where do you see the greatest cause for optimism? Aside from, of course, recognizing it could be a lot worse.
Well, the youth activities in Armenia gives a lot of hope that at least there's a segment in our society that still believe in the future of their own country. They would like to stay in the country and try to change the country from within. I see that happening in Armenia, but my fear is that if the government and the political elite does not get the message that they continue on their own path to serve their own narrow interest, that youth will lose hope, and that would be extremely dangerous for the future of the country. That's my biggest concern. That youth should not lose hope. In that sense, we don't have much time. We cannot wait another decade that Armenia transforms to a normal country. The potential is there. As we heard Acemoglu, truly in Armenian culture, in our Christian faith, there's nothing that forbids democracy to flourish as fast as possible. And it's only the political elite that's put a dent on the prospect of more democratic Armenia. As I said in my statement, it's truly unfortunate that it's been 25 years. And despite the very dire economic situation, the failures that the government after government has had, still the ruling party maintains its power and authority. This is very indicative of the fact that the elections are manipulated, and the most recent one was an evidence of that. It was hard to call an election. It was a vote-buying process. And this somehow needs to be ended, and an end needs to be put to this. And I hope the youth in Armenia, through the civil society, through their activities, they'll be able to do something about it.
Yes, so here's where I see a real opening for the future, and it's in a very indirect way, and it's single issue advocacy, or single issue activism. If you think about what it means to run a successful party and successful campaigns, we did a lot of research on these particular issues in various ways as well through, specifically in Georgia, hundreds of focus groups. So we looked at this a long time. If you think about what it takes, especially in an environment of apathy, this is incredibly hard. And if you do single issue advocacy, you have a genuine chance to work out who you work with, how you run operations. Elections are really list-running operations, lists of your own activists, lists of people you've contacted, lists of the main talking points. So there's operations. And then how you deal with crises. The experience in a lot of these contexts is that people build up crises, and it takes months and years to build up crises, to build up trust. And it evaporates like this. In 4 or 5 days, it's gone. So knowing how to deal with crises is incredibly important to break through this. Now, single issue advocacy allows you to play with that and to work on that with limited risk. Because you also say, I stand for a particular issue, and you can often reach out across political divide. This reflects a little bit my own experience, but I think it's also something we observe. In Georgia, there's a strong movement for decriminalizing, or at least decriminalizing the extent of the criminalization of drugs. But take one issue that Human Rights Watch wrote a long report on, how incredibly difficult it is for people in Armenia that are terminally ill to get access to appropriate palliative care. Now that sounds like that's a niche issue. This is not something, the reason why at first you might think about leaving Los Angeles to spend 2 years in Armenia to work on. But I think those issues and campaigning on those issues will give rise to new networks that can actually make a difference. So that's where I see the future.
Well, we've seen examples of that. Last year, the Electric Yerevan was called. It was a single advocacy issue. Mm-hmm. The government wanted to raise the price of electricity, and the people hit the street and stayed there for days and weeks protesting, and they forced the government to make some changes and modifications in their policy. So I agree with Hans that single issue advocacy, if there's a wide segment of society that are interested in that, they're affected by it, could generate certain protests that would lead to pressure and eventually change in government policies.
And as a follow-on to that, I would say the fact that you have these civil society initiatives between Turkey, Armenia and Georgia, I think that's very helpful, because over time I think these youngsters who come together go beyond, the fact, beyond history and sort of facing up to history on the Turkish side and start talking about common problems. So when gay activists come to Turkey, they meet fellow gays in Turkey and talk about, those issues. Environmentalists, ditto. And I think that sort of is helping reinforce what you were talking about inside Armenia, this contact with fellow activists.
Sure, good.
All of you have raised just now or earlier in your remarks this important dimension of regional integration, whether it was the failure of these states in their early independence to coordinate and work on integration and so transition together and realize the benefits that would have brought, or simply civil society and the points you just made of today, contacts and cooperation and linkages, I suppose, emerging. Again, a kind of integration from below. So my question is, how far along is that? Are the examples you just gave sort of exceptions and just at an infant stage, or is there significant and meaningful cross-fertilization, cooperation, meetings and travel between, let's say, especially Georgian and Armenian civil society activists, pro-democracy, electoral reform, human rights, women's rights, whatever it might be, such that you can really say that there's a lot of cooperation and it's not just occasional? Is there a sense of some kind of solidarity among pro-democracy young in existence, or at least emerging, or is this really nascent and has a long way to go? I don't have any strong impression of that, except that it's important.
Well, it's not a straight line. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's happening. But then you have, as we see in Turkey, regression at the top, the overall regression in the environment in Turkey. And so far, Turkish-Armenian reconciliation efforts, at least on the civil society level, have been spared to some extent. But unfortunately, for instance, I mean, this isn't really exactly what you were asking me about, but let me mention it in passing, that as a result of things getting worse in Turkey and the fact that the Kurdish conflict has been reignited, for instance, what was happening in Diyarbakir in particular, where you had lots of Armenians coming and all these Islamized Armenians coming forward, and the Surp Giragos church that had become a kind of venue where all these people would get together, that's all sort of evaporated, for instance. So it's not, it's very much a function of what's happening in the country overall. So it's not a straight line, as I said, it's not a linear process, but the fact that those seeds are being planted means that in future, when things get better in the country, then, you have a foundation, a base. And I think that base is important too, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's some interaction, but it's not extensive. It used to be way more. The problem with the civil society engagement and at this moment with Turkey is the lack of total lack of contacts and relationship between our two governments. Turkish-Armenian relations peaked at one point when both sides were expecting to sign the protocol. When that failed, the frustration from the Armenian side was so deep that every other venue between the two countries were eliminated, simply stopped. And that clearly affected also the civil society engagement. The government started not to encourage, even obstruct, any civil society engagement between the countries. On this Turkish-Armenian relations, I think it has now two levels. One is the protocol level, which is still out there, pending in both parliaments. On this issue, the ball is in Turkish court. Turks stopped it, they have to pick it up from where they left it. But on establishing the minimum relations that existed prior to the protocols, here the ball, I think, is in the Armenian court. Because Armenia needs that minimum contacts with Turkey so that we will have a second channel of information through Turkey as what's transpiring at other levels concerning our region. Russia-Turkey relations, how that affects our region. Our source of information now is only Russia because there's absolutely no contact, any level of contact between the Turkish and Armenian governments. I think we need to bring some level of normalcy that existed before between Turkey and Armenia so that we complement what also could happen on the public diplomacy track and civil society track.
I mean, I would add to that this is a great example, the working together of inadvertent effects of good intentions, in that fairly extensive funding was made available to get the three countries to work together on the civil society level. And I think one of the conclusions that a lot of people took out of that is that we're here because the Swiss government wants us to be here, or because the US taxpayer funds us being here, and that it ultimately felt a little claustrophobic. The Georgians were fed up with being the hosts all the time, and so there's some certain mechanisms that established themselves that in a way clouded the opportunities that may have been there, also because the particular sets of concerns that people had were rather different. But if you want to put it positively, are people looking outward? Are they open to look to other places? And I think certainly for Armenia and for Georgia, my impression, very much so. I mean, the interest in what goes on internationally, bringing that in and using the tools that are available, that's absolutely there. And I think under the auspices of something that's international, the willingness to engage is very much there. But I think one needs to be very nuanced and careful about what kind of engagement one supports.
Could I ask about the economy? And anything you want to say about it and how it's changing is important. But I'm particularly interested in the apparent incompatibility in national economic policy. Take the case of Armenia, with either having close ties, membership even, in the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. Is that over-exaggerated, and is there a course, let's say, for Armenia's future in which it could retain the vital economic ties with Russia, but reduce its dependence, its singular dependence, and at least begin developing appropriate ties with European states that over time could bring greater balance? Or is there a limit and it's really either or?
Well, it's not black and white, but the room for maneuverability for Armenia is extremely limited. Because if you're part of a free trade agreement with one country, you could still have another free trade agreement with another group or a country. But once you join a custom union, that is, you enter a common custom regulation, that limits your options to do any free trade with any other country. If Iran tomorrow opens its market, Armenia cannot have a free trade with Iran. The entire Eurasia Union body has to make a decision to have a free trade agreement with Iran so that Armenia would also benefit from it. Armenia joining the Eurasia Union not necessarily was a mistake, but I think the Armenian side should have negotiated a better deal for its membership, because Armenia is the smallest among the 4 other members. Its economy is the smallest, the size, does not have access to sea, and there's no contiguous border with the other members. That should have given Armenia the right to negotiate a better deal, to have a privileged status within the Union, so that Armenia could have a more liberal agreements, trade agreements with Georgia and also the European Union. For Armenia to balance our membership off with substantive agreement with the European Union and also free trade with Georgia is indispensable. Without it, Armenia cannot survive economically, because the custom union does not provide enough incentive for Armenia's economic development. Armenia needs to maintain that balance. I wish we would have been in a similar position as Azerbaijan. If we could have neither been there nor in the association agreement and have left our option open for a better deal in the future, I think would have put us in a better position today, and we would have taken our time and negotiated a better deal with one or the other. But whatever is done is done. What is necessary today, that we balance our membership off with a more substantive agreement with the European Union and have a deeper transatlantic relations. That would be a way out for Armenia. Otherwise, I think the consequences eventually will be more negative than positive.
Just to follow up, speaking concretely, what aspects of that closer arrangement with the European Union are possibly the near future for Armenia? Concretely, visa-free travel, some partial trade agreement? What exactly do you have in mind?
Well, it's going to be partial. It cannot be 100% association agreement. The one that was offered to Armenia, we refused that. Georgia signed it. They got their visa-free travel. I think that's a big deal that will boost Georgia's economy and also the population's morale. These are no small things for the citizens of Armenia or the Caucasus. The agreement that Armenia now is in the process of finalizing with the European Union, and I'm not familiar with the content, but my sense is that does not have a very deep content because of our limitations from our membership in the Eurasian Union. The European Union has the policy of gives you as much as you can take. You want this much, they give you this much. You want this much, you have the possibility to get it. What Armenia is getting with this bilateral agreement with the European Union is too little because of our limitation. That's why I said we need to reopen our membership issue within the Eurasia Union and ask for bigger room to maneuver and have more privileged agreements with Georgia and the European Union. Whether we'll be able to do that or not, that's very questionable, and also will depend much on the future relationship between Russia and the European Union.
Also, opening the borders with Turkey could have a transformational impact, I think, not just on the economy, but on politics too, because I mean, it's often been argued that the stranglehold of the oligarchs would be shattered if that border were to be opened, but obviously it doesn't look to be likely in the near future. But if it were to happen, also tourism, I think, would become a big factor, no, in the economy. If you had especially people from here going first to Western Armenia, then on to Eastern Armenia. It's often been discussed.
Well, there's no doubt that will impact positively Armenia's economy. But again, Turkey continues to link that bilateral ties with Armenia to the Nagorno-Karabakh resolution. And that is a complicated issue. It doesn't seem like being resolved any time in the near future.
I mean, I would add that on the question of being into finding a middle way between the trading partners, that may be a useful ways to really useful approaches to focus on what works. And the nascent aspects of what we see to be very successful in Armenia is STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, so that really being an aspect to focus on and to develop, where some donor externally financed initiatives, I think, have had a great impact and are really a model to a lot of countries in terms of what can happen. In terms of the actual trading with the European Union, I think it's useful to watch Georgia closely and to see, is that really of great interest to Armenia at this point. Agricultural imports, Armenia offers no, I don't think, any kind of strong kind of climatic differentiation. The kind of climate that Armenia has, you replicate in places like Spain. Georgia is a little different because it has humid subtropical areas, which Armenia doesn't have. And even in Georgia, there is not that much trade flowing to Europe at this point yet. So the sensible thing, especially given that the operating circumstances for businesses are likely to remain very, very constrained because we have this kind of oligarchic system, or systems that that are kind of virtualized. And I think emphasizing that, making as much of that as possible, is an opportunity. Also because if any of you have read this fascinating series that James Fallows wrote about what are the non-obvious places in the United States that are resilient in a context of a lot of decline. And the argument being made by James Fallows was that you see that resilience in places that are actually good for lifestyle reasons. In Burlington, Vermont, and he lists a couple of other places. And ultimately for Armenia to trade on that it's possible to live relatively inexpensively, at the same time potentially earn internationally with virtualized work, is something that could actually hold more people there, bring talented people there, and allow some economic activity to succeed. But that hope is in STEM, and you don't actually need great customs arrangement for that right now. So I think there's an option. That's what I'm trying to say.
Could I shift direction a little bit and again try to understand the young generation in Georgia, but especially Armenia better, and in particular the relations between the two? What do opinion polls show? What do social relations? What do travel preferences? And just your own instinct. Again, you give the example of the importance of the Georgian experiment, what Georgia is doing now for Armenia as a model, or at least partial model. So that's why I'm asking about public opinion and the young generation between, let's say, 18 and 40 in Armenia, and what they think of when they look to Georgia as a possible model, as something to admire, or perhaps also lingering resentments and frictions that maybe hold some of that back. Give us a picture of.
Well, Hans, I'm sure, has some numbers of his polls that conducted. If you could provide those, then maybe
Well, I mean, we ask those questions, and by the way, my old organization asks those questions, and in case you haven't checked them out, I encourage you to do that. Under the Caucasus Barometer, where the most recent data from Armenia is 2015, where we also ask, would you be would you want to do business? Do you approve of doing business with a range of different populations? And you kind of can see how exactly that works. And I think, I mean, in general, we see certainly between Armenia and Georgia, there's openness. But there is a level, I think, as I said, where the perspectives are, at least my sense are, the perspectives are that people are much more likely to know both in Georgia and Armenia, to know who the FBI, who's in charge of the FBI in the US than they might know who a kind of a minister is in the respective other country. So I think, I mean, there's a kind of parallelism of looking to other places, not necessarily at each other. And I think that that's something that, that hopefully would change at some point with more awareness.
Not necessarily looking at Georgia as a model, but increasingly you hear more and more people talking about Georgia and the successes they've been having. Some Armenian businesses are moving to Georgia because of their better tax policies, because of the openness, the lack of the oligarchic influence there. It's easier to access money from banks. Their interests are lower. And during this parliamentary election campaign, there was a lot of discussion and talk making that comparison between Georgia and Armenia, particularly in the context that at one point during my ministerial time, as I used to travel to Georgia and talk to officials, see the frustration and disappointment, and then come back, and how proud I would feel about the progress we've been making in Armenia. Now that the situation has reversed and it's the opposite, it's very frustrating to see things moving quickly in Georgia, and Armenia is lagging behind. The number of foreign direct investment that has been published lately in Georgia last year was 1.7 billion US dollars. Armenia's FDI was $130 million. I mean, it's a huge difference. The number of tourists visiting Georgia passed the 5 million mark. Armenia is still around 300 to 400,000. So Georgia, comparatively, is moving much faster in leaps and bounds based on these numbers, compared to Armenia. And the deeper that difference gets, more difficult will be the interaction between the two countries. So we're losing touch with the Georgians. And the point I was trying to make in my statement, that nothing common has been left between the three Caucasus countries. The European integration was the last hope that existed, at least with Georgia and Armenia as a common goal. That also evaporated with Armenia's membership in the Eurasian, and this is extremely concerning, and it's an existential issue for Armenia when that axis around Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, where Azerbaijan and Turkey putting a lot of efforts to bring also Georgia on board to isolate Armenia, could be a serious security concern in the coming years.
We're short on time, so let me turn to Amberin for a final question, and others if there's a moment afterwards. And go back to the geopolitical level, and Turkey, Russia, the US. Are the circumstances propitious for Armenia to make some of these changes and move forward? Or are we likely to discover that, let's say, for example, Russia puts a limit on how much Armenia can integrate or wean itself away from sole influence on Russia, and will we possibly be reminded rudely, as we were in 2008, perhaps because of some fear of NATO expansion, that no, Russia wants to keep Armenia dependent, controlled, and
well, we know that
dreaming.
It does that. It does want that, but I think the interesting question is what might Donald Trump possibly do if we see a sort of escalation in tensions between Russia and the United States? Would that be confined to the Syrian theater, or could we see that shifting in ways to that would have Washington actually reinvigorating efforts to promote reconciliation between Armenia and Turkey? because that would surely be one way of sort of countering Russian influence if you could get those two. After all, Turkey is the front line, the NATO front line, as viewed from Moscow. So if the United States could bring Turkey and Armenia back to the negotiating table, or actually the protocols are right there, and what if, this referendum, I think what if is probably an optimistic way of putting it. When Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, gets his yes vote, will he feel confident enough then, perhaps that's a sort of optimistic, some would say naive way of looking at things, then to sort of, in a bid to re-establish himself as a, world leader, sort of re-burnish his credentials, sort of move on Cyprus, move on Armenia. I think we'll have to see. There might be an opportunity there.
Unfortunately, time has run out. Has to do with the broadcast in Yerevan, our international connections. We're only just beginning, as you can see. Join us tomorrow, starting, I think, about 9 o'clock for coffee, 9:30 for the first panel in the University Club, the Scriptorum Room, for a lot more. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Vartan. Thank you, Amberin. Thank you, Rob. Thanks to all of you. Tomorrow, 9 to 5:30, it is being live streamed. It is also interpreted into Armenian again all day tomorrow. And because we can't lose an opportunity for a commercial, Innovate Armenia is September 23. It's not Palm Sunday, so it should be good. So please join us again tomorrow if you can. And in any case, just so I recognize, and most of tomorrow's speakers are here today with us, and it is going to be a very different kind of very interesting conversation. Please do try to tune in if you're unable to come. Thank you, and thank you.